Well, I hope that video wasn't too terrifying for you, but it brings up some interesting and compelling points. And certainly, this is not an issue that is going away. So, just 5 months ago, in December of 2019, the company Ring, who creates these doorbells and cameras, got a lot of flack for security issues with how they were handling customers' videos, where they were storing those videos. A number of those videos were being pushed to some potentially shady company in Ukraine. And as I said, this was just in December of last year. What really struck me from the TEDx talk was the creepy doll that could potentially talk back to you or be hacked in some surprising ways. And again, this is not a solved or problem that has gone away. So this is just in March of this year. So just about a month ago, that was an article on Fox about the case against Smart Baby Tech, which describes a story of the iBaby monitor being hacked and then having random hackers be able to talk to your children from afar and potentially say some relatively unsavory things, or have random hackers engage with your children. This is probably something that most parents would not be particularly comfortable with. So then we are left with this question about who has responsibility for cybersecurity in this kind of context. Is it us as consumers who are just responsible for knowing all of the security issues that might come with the technology that we're purchasing? Is it the company from whom we purchase this technology? If one of their pieces of technology that we purchase is hacked or exploited in some way, and then we suffer some kind of damage, is the company legally liable for this? Or is this the role for the government and for law enforcement agencies to protect us as the consumer and companies within the government's borders? Or is it the government's role to enact legislation that then obligates these consumer or these customer or obligates these companies to provide security or bake in some significant level of security into their technology, which has the likely unfortunate result of increasing cost and complexity for the technology that we buy. But then if it's the company's obligation to do so, maybe that's just something that we have to live with. So now that we've talked about some of these issues with cybersecurity and its implications, you should be able to answer a number of these learning objectives now, like defining vulnerability and exploit. What are some cybersecurity issues that could affect your daily life? How do you define the Internet of Things? And some trade-offs in security and convenience that may come with this ubiquitous technology. So the next thing we'll talk about is cybersecurity and its global implications. So this is what we just talked about, was sort of small scale implications for you, the consumer, but now we can look at it in terms of how society is impacted or how governments have to respond to these kinds of issues. So some objectives here is to be able to define the term of hacker and hacktivist, defining cyber warfare and how is cyber warfare different from classical kinetic warfare, differentiating cyber warfare from espionage, and describing some reasons why a person or company might not report a hack or report being a victim of some security issue. So first, in the context of cybersecurity, you may hear the term hacker used often and in some pejorative sense. A lot of companies like to just place all the blame on these hackers who are potentially using computers to gain unauthorized access. So this article from HackerOne talks about what are the different definitions of hacker, and how in most dictionaries hacker is definitely termed as some negative thing or negative role. But this article is interesting because it goes into some amount of depth about how hackers sort of describe themselves. So one is about being a hacker is more about being a problem solver. Another is a hacker is somebody who is interested in breaking things and finding out how to put them back together. Or a hacker is someone who takes something that is designed for one purpose and uses it for another purpose. Or going back to the first one, about problem solving. So it's not necessarily meant to be a social ill. In fact, hackers play a pretty significant role in the cybersecurity realm in providing security or doing or services like penetration testing, where some company may go to some third party or some security consultant and ask that consultant to try and break into their systems and evaluate the level of security that their cybersecurity regime provides for their customers, which is could be a potentially critical role in making sure that you are in fact providing some level of security. From a social perspective, hackers have also sort of adopted a new kind of role in society. It started in the 2010s with this idea of hacktivism, where a hacktivist is someone who uses hacking to bring about political or social change in an activist way. So in the early 2010s, as I mentioned, there was a lot of interesting behaviors around hacktivism, where in 2011, as part of Operation Tunisia, a hacktivist group began one of the first efforts to push for regime change in the Middle East, which is recognized as being part of the early onset of the Arab Spring, or a hacktivist group holding Egyptian government websites hostage until the president Mubarak stepped down, or Operation Darknet, where a group of anonymous hackers broke into some child pornography websites and published over 1,500 names of people who were going to these sites. So this is all about bringing about some amount of social change, or doing ostensibly some amount of social good using these using potentially nefarious means. And part of this was the LulzSec organization that was broken up by the FBI around 2011. So there are definitely social ill and social good aspects to the hacktivist culture. A couple of years ago, or I guess about a year ago, there was a piece done by Wired on hacktivism and how the number of hacktivists around the world are increasing. This hacktivist activity is definitely on the rise, but unfortunately the efficacy of these efforts appears to be going down as governments find better ways to clamp down on this kind of behavior. And there's a gray line between hacktivism and much more negative kinds of behavior, which we see in the United States, where WikiLeaks releasing a large set of documents that were hacked from the CIA could potentially have significant impact on the national security of the United States, or give up national secrets to other countries who may use them in less good ways, to the way that Hillary Clinton's emails were hacked and then published as part of a potential election interference campaign in the 2016 presidential election. You could view these kinds of behaviors as examples of hacktivism if somebody didn't particularly like the way the CIA was operating, or wanted to expose potential corruption in Hillary Clinton's campaign. Then you might view these as hacktivist examples. But at the same time, if you're the U.S. government, you would have a very different perspective on, are these encroachments of national sovereignty? Are these actual attacks by other countries? So WikiLeaks may not be an attack by another country, but this, with the substantial amount of evidence showing that the hack of Hillary Clinton's emails was perpetrated by a Russian government-funded organization, then this is potentially an infringement upon American sovereignty and could be a pretty significant issue for the United States and its defense. So given these kinds of issues, how should governments respond to hacktivism or hacking attacks in this regard? Or should the intent of these kinds of attacks make any difference? And sort of more troublingly, when you are the victim of one of these hacktivist kinds of attacks, how do you launch a counterstrike, or how do you sort of respond to these kinds of issues? And this leads us to the larger issue of cyber war and cyber warfare. So what does this mean? Cyber warfare is actions, or are actions, by a nation state or some international organization to attack and attempt to damage another nation's computers or information networks through computer viruses or denial of service attacks, or similar sorts of detrimental activity. So there's another YouTube video here from the National Geographic about the future of cyber warfare. I'll give you a second to watch that. I'll note this link starts 12 seconds in. That is done on purpose to avoid some graphics that I thought were troubling and didn't want to propagate.